From TeachIllinois.com, this is The Teacher's Classroom, the podcast that explores current issues and topics in education and how they relate to teaching and students. Here is your host, Matt Weld.
I'm going to start off with a story. This story is from my first or second year teaching, and I had a student in my class. We'll call him Nick. Nick was one of those kids that was always vying for my attention and the attention of all the other kids in the class. And one day in particular, he came up with this great trick where he could take the chain of his necklace. It was one of those ball chains like a dog tag would hang on. And somehow he was able to make it go in his mouth and out his nose. And he just thought this was uproarious that he could somehow floss his face. Well, as a first or second year teacher, I had no idea how to even address this problem. So I took him out in the hall and he squeezed himself into this little alcove and said, "You don't see me." So I said, "Okay, Nick, let's go to the office." And the whole way to the office, something about that trip set him off. Of course, as a new teacher, I had, 20 years ago, we did not know about trauma or being trauma informed or triggers or anything like that. And so the whole way to the office, he was bouncing himself off the lockers. "You don't see me." Bounce, clang. "I'm invisible." Bang. By the time we got to the office, he was screaming and yelling, and I had no idea what to do. And so I told the secretary, I said, "I need to get back to my class." And I left Nick in the office. And frankly, I'm not sure what happened in the office. I know he came back the next day and everything progressed as usual. I know that we've all had these instances that become stories in our professional libraries. We store them away to tell friends who don't understand what it is to be a teacher, or we save them away for that day when we're going to write our memoirs. But I feel that if you look even closer, the story is about two people who want to be able to communicate with each other, but who can't. The story is about a caring adult and a child who needs something, but neither has the language to tell the other what needs to be said. And I'm not even sure that 20 years later, I would know what to say to Nick that might start a meaningful relationship that then could work toward addressing the underlying problems. So this is where becoming a trauma-informed school is so important. This is where listening to experts, such as those on this show, I know we've had episodes on trauma before, but also reading books, having discussions can be vital to helping those kids. But then the question comes, what about the adults? What happens to adults who have Nicks in their classes every year, each with unique needs? Teaching is a helping profession, similar to first responders, social workers, in that those of us who are drawn to teach deeply feel the need to help others. And I feel that in our conversations about becoming trauma-informed, we also need to talk about the trauma on the adults in the building. And so to help me understand more about this, I called Lisa Dinhofer. She will be a featured speaker at the Directions Conference here on June 12th. But more importantly, Lisa is an expert who consults with organizations of helping professionals, such as schools and emergency responders.
I call myself a crisis tamer. That's the short version. I go into usually businesses, companies, and I mentor them through a destabilizing event that could be anywhere from an active shooter, workplace violence, bullying, sexual harassment, a large reduction in force, scandal, anything that is a destabilizing event. It can even include the death of an employee. As background, I'm a certified thanatologist, and that is someone who specializes in grief, with a subspecialty in trauma. I'm also a communications expert, so I combine how to have very difficult conversations, like death notifications, terminating an employee, having to give some type of very difficult news, with trauma responses, grief responses. But in the business world, there's a lot of focus on prevention and containment of a destabilizing event, but not necessarily the aftermath, which can last a long time. So I mentor companies and environments through the aftermath of a destabilizing event, whether it was expected or unexpected.
So a couple things here. First of all, you mentioned that there's the containment right at the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But then there's the whole issues afterwards.
Yeah.
So I can see where in a school, for example, something may happen, something traumatic, and you deal with the parents and you deal with the local first responders or whoever else may be involved. But then there's the whole aftermath of that no one ever really thinks about. Right? It's the immediate response that hits the news, but then it's forgotten about to everyone else.
Right, to everyone else except the people who are involved. And I always say that crisis is temporary, but aftermath is permanent, right? Mm-hmm. So what goes on in the containment, there are consequences to that in the aftermath, but aftermath is very much misunderstood to be temporary, that once this event has happened, that it's some kind of a linear progression after that to everyone getting back to normal and getting sorted. And that's not the reality of trauma. And if there's been death involved, grief as well. And trauma doesn't play fair. So what I mean by that is it's not a linear progression. You can have, for instance, a destabilizing event in an environment and seemingly you have an employee or students or whatever that seem to be doing okay. And then maybe 3 months later, one day, they pull into the parking lot and they can't get out of the car. And they can't walk through the front door. They can't walk through the building. That is not unusual for trauma. It's not a linear progression. And because trauma and grief responses are so misunderstood, they are often labeled as malingering or trying to play the system or discipline issues. And they're not. They are human responses to trauma and loss, that from a trauma perspective, trauma is a cognitive process and grief is the emotional response to loss.
That's interesting. So there's the whole cognitive plus emotional response. Correct. And we have to transition from one to the other, or probably have the two work together, probably is a better way.
Well, the rule of thumb, first of all, if someone's been through a traumatizing event, and by the way, trauma doesn't always have to be what's called a big T event, like something really obvious, like, God forbid, an active shooter come in. Everyone understands it's very traumatic. Mm-hmm. But a traumatic event can be seemingly not traumatic to some people, but have that effect on that individual based on their history and what they've already been through. So they may have been triggered in some way where it has activated the trauma response. If there's been both trauma and loss together, the rule of thumb is that you have to address the trauma first before you can address the grief and the loss. And trauma is a cognitive process. It is what the brain does in response to an event that activates the amygdala, activates the survival mechanism. And there's lots of responses, emotional responses to that later on. But you have to deal with what the brain is doing first before you can deal with the emotional responses later. And our brain is hardwired, actually, to accommodate these kinds of events, provided that the event is not too severe in intensity or in duration. Typically, if we know how to work with the brain, if we give ourselves a good 4 weeks and we don't get re-triggered, and we know how to work with our brain, after the 4 weeks, most people do not develop the very common familiar PTSD. That is not a universal. Just because you've been through a traumatic event, it doesn't mean you're going to develop PTSD. The development of that has a lot to do with what happened to you before this event, and also what's happened in those 4 weeks after, whether you've been triggered or not, whether there were other things going on, or the event itself was just too overwhelming and the brain is not being able to calm down. So it's why a diagnosis of PTSD can't be made until a good 4 weeks have passed. And you have to look at the symptoms that person is experiencing in terms of involuntary flashbacks, avoidance of triggers, and a whole lot of other things in terms of, are these things increasing in intensity and frequency? Are they remaining the same? Are they reducing? So it's not necessarily easy or automatic to diagnose PTSD after an event, but that label gets put on people too quickly. And when that label gets put on someone, you're isolating them, from their peer group or their tribe. And it may be quite inaccurate, actually.
So, for example, in a school, say a fight breaks out in the hallway. And for some teachers, for some adults, let's say the adults in the building, it may be another event, right? But for others, it may be a trigger to something previously, or maybe something they've never witnessed before, and so it's especially emotional?
Correct. Trauma responses erupt from a whole host of, stimulation and data to the brain that in some people would not necessarily trigger a trauma response, and in others it does. And the first category that you mentioned, what's happened to them before, this could be triggering of a trauma file that's already in their brain from a previous event. And a really common example of that is you have someone who's come home from, being in a war zone, and what they endured there and the results on their brain can be triggered from seemingly innocuous stimuli here, like the sounds of cars or loud bangs or fireworks or things that normally don't create a trauma response. But for someone who's already had a trauma happen to their brain, and particularly if it's lingering, they haven't been able to actually get it transferred over to the left side of the brain. And what I mean by that is when we're in a PTSD situation, a lingering trauma, it's stuck on the right side of our brain, right? And it's why talk therapy doesn't do so well with that, because talk therapy only can get to the left side of the brain. So other modalities for dislodging that information from the right side of the brain to get it to the left side of the brain, where then talk therapy can happen, are very effective. Those mind-body modalities, very effective. But you can be triggered where data coming at you or stimuli coming at you triggers the brain to say, oh, we know how to do this. And it pulls the file forward from a previous trauma experience. And at that moment, the brain cannot distinguish between a previous trauma versus the stimuli that they've experienced now, which is why people can have involuntary responses when they're not in a trauma situation, but they got triggered, right? So that's when someone's had a previous experience. The next example that you gave is that they've seen something they've never experienced before, and it was just too overwhelming.
Right.
So it overwhelmed the brain, and the brain went into what it is hardwired to do, right? Go into that fight, flight, or freeze. The amygdala lights up, and all those stress chemicals marinate the body, and the brain is doing what it's supposed to be doing to help you survive that experience, because your brain believes you're in survival mode, and many times you are.
Right.
But if there's been too much cascading of those stress chemicals from the brain, that can push you into some lingering trauma response difficulties. So does that kind of help you a little bit with your question?
It does. Yes. Yeah. So you are a consultant who works with businesses and police departments, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm. I work with first responders. I work within all different kinds of corporate environments. It really doesn't matter the industry, because destabilizing events can happen in any industry. I work with people who are exposed to graphic material a lot, so that can be prosecutors. A whole host of my client base is quite diverse, because the material I work with can impact anybody at any time. So it can be teachers, it can be, anyone. And I work with both professionals as well as the lay public.
And so it seems like a lot of these groups that you work with are just that. They are groups that are kind of like families in and of themselves. Does that impact at all the way you help them?
Yes, because, and thank you for identifying that, because whenever I go into an organization of any kind, there's always culture. Mm-hmm. And it's imperative for me to understand the culture and what makes one a part of that culture, or what will cause someone to be marginalized from that culture, which can become a separate problem in and of itself. And that is very much the case with law enforcement. If someone gets marginalized from their unit, that is a really bad place to be in. Right. Every organization, regardless of what its mission, has a culture. Some cultures are toxic, other cultures are not. But that culture is very much tied to identity markers. The people who work within that culture have an identity marker of who they are, what it is they do, and what it is they do within that culture. I do a lot of work with, child protective agencies, and they are exposed to a lot of graphic material, and they have a lot of very often destabilizing cases when a child in their care dies, or there's been some kind of, I've worked with homicide, suicide cases of families who are under their care. And mental health care professionals have a very strong identity marker of being helpful, of giving that help, but not needing that help. Law enforcement is the same. Teachers are the same.
I was going to say.
and that, of course, that defies reality, right? Because everybody at some point needs help. But people in helping professions often take on the mythology that if you need help and you ask for help, well, that means you're not a very good helper. And so that can affect the identity marker of someone within any institution. And senior leadership, key example of this. When a destabilizing event happens in an organization, they're impacted too. But they often receive the advice, quote unquote, don't show that you've been impacted. If you're getting help to deal with this, by all means, don't tell anybody. Because there's this assumption that needing help and getting help diminishes your ability to lead and for people to see you as a leader. And nothing could be further from the truth. It is the biggest lie out there. And in fact, when senior leadership acknowledges to their people that they've been impacted as well, they close a gap and become closer aligned with their stakeholders, but also they're modeling the behavior. Of course, this has impacted me. It's impacted you, and it's okay to get help so that we can all get back to the business of creating a new normal and moving forward. They are the leaders, and people will take their cue. So if the cue is don't talk about it, don't acknowledge it, well, that's what stakeholders will do as well. And that can end up closing the doors of that business.
And so I'm wondering if, because you talked about how the identity markers in a police force, which is, I still think, predominantly male, and whereas education is still predominantly female. Does gender play a role in that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, men are still acculturated, maybe not as much as in previous decades, but acculturated, particularly in a law enforcement environment, that they're strong, that they, first responders are trained, they run towards the danger, not away from it. And in that training, they literally get their brains trained for risk reduction responses so that they are able to do what normally their brain would say, get the heck out of here. Right?
Yeah.
Firefighters go through the same thing. Even those who capture snakes in warm environments, they go through a training to reduce that flight response away from danger. And so in law enforcement cultures, the notion we're the ones people call when they're afraid, when they're in trouble. We're the ones that come in and make everything okay. We're the ones that come in and catch the bad guys from hurting anyone else. And so for people in that environment to acknowledge and admit that, yes, they're afraid and or they've been impacted by something that human beings are not supposed to be seeing on a regular basis, that is just so counter to the culture and the identity marker of that environment and that task. And I know a lot of police forces now are working actively to change that so that it's okay to acknowledge I was impacted by seeing a child dead in the back seat of a car. This is a big thing for people who are on fatal collision units. They see an awful lot of dead people and a lot of dead kids, unfortunately, in cars. And, it's okay to say, yeah, that played with my head. I'm having visualizations about that. Or any of the other very graphic kinds of tasks they have to do, particularly if they're on a unit of, finding pedophiles and tracking those who sexually abuse children. That is a kind of work that really does things to the brain. And it does things to their relationships at home. And even the FBI knows that they're special agents who do that. They're only allowed to do that for a limited amount of time. I think it's 3 years unless they've changed that because they know the impact it has. But smaller community agencies or state agencies don't have the manpower necessarily. So people are in there doing this work when they've been impacted and they're getting continually damaged, and there's no one else to replace them. Prosecutors who prosecute pedophiles and sexual abusers, the same thing. They are severely impacted by the overexposure of this kind of graphic material that literally does things to the brain.
Well, and then in education, it seems like we have these kids coming to us and we, in order to personalize education and, teach the whole child and all these initiatives in education, which I think are good ideas, but we all of a sudden know more about the history of the kids that are coming to us.
Right.
And you've already said that we are one of those helping professions where it's part of our, I don't know if it's genetic, but it's part of our personalities to run forward and help those who are less fortunate. And so it seems like we are taking on we are assuming a lot of emotional pushback.
Oh, yeah. Teachers are primed for something called moral distress, which we see is epidemic in healthcare. But moral distress is when you are confronted with information, situation, whatever, that violates your core ethics and your professional standards of duty, but you feel constrained from acting out against it or speaking up against it. Great example of this is when you are aware as a bystander that sexual harassment is happening to one of your coworkers, but out of fear, which is the abusers are very good at creating that fear, you remain quiet because you're afraid of becoming a target or losing your job. Same thing with teachers. They may, through their discussions with children, learn things about that child or what's going on in the home that it's not always such an easy equation about speaking up, or who should they go to, or did they not do enough to stop it? Did they not go to the right people, or they did go to the right people to speak up, but that person who has the authority that they didn't do anything about it. And so that abuse perhaps continued. Moral distress has very definite symptoms, and it's an ongoing problem. And every time the person is faced with yet another situation that creates another crescendo of moral distress, it accumulates and it can ruin your career. Teachers are primed for that.
Ruin your career as in burnout, or as...
Yes. Yeah, burnout, which, by the way, is not the same as compassion fatigue. The two get used interchangeably, and that's inaccurate. Compassion fatigue is about the work, right? You've just helped to the point where your internal gas tank is empty, and you just can't help anymore. And you don't even care what's causing this person distress because you're just that tired and depleted. That's about the work. Burnout is about the system within which you do the work, right? So it can create apathy and anger and cynicism and, a disengagement and depression. And moral distress is a driver of burnout. And so people either just disengage and phone it in. They stay in the job, but they're disengaged, so they're not getting any kind of meaningful interaction with their job, and their passion is extinguished, or they leave the profession.
Okay, so I'm not sure I understand how moral distress, compassion fatigue, and burnout are related. So moral distress and compassion fatigue can both result in burnout?
Oh, yeah, they're drivers of it.
Okay.
Absolute drivers of it. So if you're in a situation where you don't have the authority to speak up or address or change what is causing that violation of your ethical code and your professional code, like you're in a position where you can only report it to someone else or a committee or whatever, but they don't do anything about it and it continues.
Like you can call,
and you're in that place of powerlessness, right?
Yeah, so we could call DCFS, but then if DCFS doesn't do anything,
right,
we as an educator can't, address it directly.
Right. I mean, you can't exactly, go on a tirade on social media or go to
knock on the house.
I mean, you can't knock on the house. You might try out of desperation, but you realize that in your distress, your moral distress of your ethical code of caring for children and making sure they're not injured, when you're constrained from being able to accomplish that, it can just extinguish your passion for the career that you're in, erode the respect you might have for those authority figures who do have that responsibility. It can create tremendous apathy of why bother? Why am I here? It's never going to change. This isn't what I signed up for, but I need to hang in there because I need the benefits and I need the paycheck. That kind of position, when one gets into that and it's ongoing, it colors the whole quality of your life, not just your work life, but the people you live with at home, your relationships, your engagement in your community. It affects everything within your world, and not in a good way.
So when a teacher has a bad day at school and they come home and their partner does not have the compassion, or I don't know, compassion is probably not the right word, but maybe the understanding,
right,
of their, what's actually happened to them during the day, and maybe the teacher doesn't I just can't explain it. I don't want to live through it again. I don't have the words.
Right.
And so I'm sure that's hard as well.
Yes. And it people who are in positions where, jobs that they have a high exposure to graphic material or high stress. And again, we're teachers, healthcare professionals, particularly in, like the ER, law enforcement. And if you've got moral distress going on top of it, which means there's a layer of shame, there's a shame humming underneath the surface for you for not being able to really get anything done about this. You come home and your partner, your life partner, your family, your children, all they know is that you're in a bad mood. You don't talk anymore. You don't laugh anymore. You're constantly yelling at the kids all the time. You don't have patience. Nothing makes you happy. That hot fudge sundae you used to love every Saturday night, you could care less. Mm-hmm. There's a dysthymia, which is the inability to experience joy and happiness. It wears on a family. And when that person can't articulate why they feel the way they do, it causes a lot of confusion, first of all, with the people you live with. And then they begin to create their own narratives because you haven't filled in that narrative for them. And many times they misinterpret, well, he or she just doesn't love me anymore. They don't want to be here anymore. There's something wrong with them. I just don't like them anymore. We don't get on with each other. We don't have anything in common anymore. There's this whole narrative that gets created because the real story has not been articulated. And you're right. When you're living through this during the day, the last thing you want to do when you go home is explain this.
Mm-hmm. Right.
You don't want to relive it, right? So it's imperative that you have a support network in place and that there is someone you are talking with this about. It doesn't have to be professional. It can be a friend or someone that you've designated and they've agreed to hear all of this. Be the one that you can throw all of this in their lap and they can hold on to it for you so you can get some relief and then go home and engage in your personal world. But a lot of people don't have that in place. If you're in a job where the stress level is such that your amygdala is on all day long, right? So you're in that fight or flight all day long. You're in that sympathetic mode all day long. When you get home or you get off shift, your brain does this huge pendulum shift into the parasympathetic mode where you basically just shut down. And law enforcement, this is a major issue in law enforcement. They just shut down. And it becomes very difficult to engage with the people that you live with and participate in your family life. And the attempt is to be shut down long enough to get back to a baseline before you have to go back to work tomorrow. And usually there's not enough time. Mm-hmm. So someone in an occupation like that is constantly shifting between that sympathetic and parasympathetic mode. And it's just ruinous to your personal relationships and your work relationships.
Even though this huge shift from the sympathetic to the parasympathetic systems at the end of the day can be tough on both the professional and their loved ones, there is hope. In the next episode, Lisa and I discuss preemptive resilience training and the best shifts for undergraduate teacher training programs. We also talk about some behaviors that will immediately help us through our days. My name is Matt Weld, and I'm your host on the Teacher's Classroom, which is supported by the Illinois Area 5 Regional Offices of Education. Notes and links can be found on teachillinois.com/podcast. I hope you'll join Lisa and me for the next episode. Until then, take care.